Sorry about that. So, time. As I started to tell you, physicists will tell you all kinds of things about time, and things I barely understand, I have to admit. And it's for that reason that I'm going to show you this one, because well, I couldn't resist. I just read this article about Star Wars. Who hasn't? We all know, of course, that Princess Leia and Luke are twins. But they're not, yeah, I know, spoiler alert. 1985, not even in this movie they tell you, but anyway, but they're not the same age. There are more than 600 days, there's more than 600 days difference in their ages, because they travel at different speeds for different lengths of time in one of the movies. And someone at the University of Leicester started to calculate what their exact age difference would be. Now, that is all I'm going to say about time dilution. Historians and art historians see time slightly differently. At least we use it in a different way, because we talk about historical time. And historical time is a lot shorter. Historical time, by definition, is only the time since we've invented writing, so about 5,000 years now. And we, of course, have a date these days. We say it's the year 2015, for a couple of weeks left. And we define the year nowadays by the orbit of the Earth around the Sun, right? Nothing new about that. And you might be tempted to think that we started at year 0, and so that 2015 orbits ago, Jesus was born. Now that is very, very, very unlikely. And not just because it's unlikely that there ever was a Jesus of Nazareth, but because it's not 2015 orbits ago. And I'm going to tell you why. But before we do that, I'll show you something about why we have years in the first place. Of course, calendars have existed for ages and ages, at least as long as we've had writing, probably longer, because they're a way to organize your year. And this is, I think, a lovely illustration of how you can show people what to do in what month. We have months, so you can tell people at what time they have to do what. And we even have books that explain this for the very, very rich. This is the Tradie Caesar, the Duc de Berry. It was made in around about the same year that this basement was built, about 1412. And this is the month of August. And it shows you what you're supposed to do in August. There's also one for December, but it's a very boring picture, so I took one for August. Here's a detail of it. If you're rich, you have to do stuff with falcons. That's the good life, I suppose. If you're poor, you have to harvest or go swimming. In the nude, by the way. But this sort of organizes the year, and we have religious festivals to mark periods of the year. And calendars were built around that. For obvious reasons, the first calendars were moon-based, because it's such an easy cycle to follow. The trouble is, the moon doesn't, the moon phases don't correspond to the solar year. They miss it by about 11 days. You know, the moon months typically last for about 29 days instead of 30 or 31. So if you have a number of lunar years, you need leap months instead of leap days that we have. But the Sumerians invented this system. The Hebrews copied it, and it was a popular calendar system for a very long time. It still exists today in many cultures. But it's crap, really. It doesn't help you because you have to adjust to the sun every couple of years, and it's a bad system. And that's why the Romans were very good at organizing stuff, and so they felt the need to have a calendar that is solar-based. The Julian calendar. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in what we now call the year 49 BCE. And that is, by the way, not before Christ, but before Common Era. These days you're not supposed to say before Christ, but before Common Era. For reasons I will explain. But they had the calendar based on months, 12 months in a year, 30 days or 31 days, alternating, and every 4 year, a leap year, to have one extra day, because of course it's not 365 days in a year, but 365 days and a little less than 6 hours. And of course, Romans did it. Rome, by the way, if you would now live in the year 0, and you lived somewhere in Europe, pretty much everyone would tell you it was the year 753. Because the Romans counted from the foundation of Rome. At least some of them did. Not everybody adhered to the same calendar. Of course, Rome was founded by these two little guys. Well, they're supposed to be Romulus and Remus. And they were sons of Mars, and founded the city, or at least Romulus did, not Remus, otherwise Rome would have to be called Reme. And they're not the only ones actually who founded Rome. Aeneas did as well. And Mars did himself. There's 3 different myths, and they all happened at the same time, which makes them so reliable. But of course, nowadays we count back to in Anno Domini, and someone had to come up with that. And that was this guy. His name is Dionysius Exiguus, which translates to Dennis the Dwarf. Actually, the dwarf doesn't mean he was short or anything. It means humble. He called himself Dionysius the Humble. And he did a lot of things. He, in the 6th century, what we now call the 6th century, started to say we have to start counting to the year of the incarnation of our Lord. Now, the incarnation has been translated a lot, and the original word of him, we don't have it anymore. So we're not sure exactly what term he used. But incarnation could mean 2 things. It could be the birth of Jesus. It could also be his resurrection. That means that we have a gap of 33 years, because he was 33 when he was crucified. We just don't know which number he used. Because what we do know is that the early Christians, especially in the West, didn't celebrate Christmas as we do. Certainly not as we do, they didn't have Coca-Cola. But Christmas wasn't that important in early Christianity. And still in Eastern Christianity, Easter is much more important than Christmas, because being born isn't much of a miracle. I mean, my wife said it was such a miracle when her children were born, but I have to admit it's a very, very common miracle. However, being resurrected, that is a miracle. And that's what made him the Christ, the Messiah, and that's what should be celebrated. If you ever have the chance to celebrate Easter, for instance, in Greece, it's fantastic. But this man, he lived, well, in the year that he calculated back to the year, well, not 0, but 1. He didn't know the number 0. It didn't exist yet. Nobody had thought of a 0. He used Roman numerals. They don't have a 0. It took ages before they invented the 0. So, whatever he said it was the incarnation of Jesus, would have been the year 1, not 0. And he said he lived in year 525 when he did this. It was the year, of course, 1728, I guess. No, 1287 in Roman times. But 525 is what he said. We don't know, of course, if this was the birth or the resurrection, but we commonly see this as the year of the birth of Jesus. And even if we do say this was the birth of Jesus, we're not entirely sure what year that was. And we can't be sure. Because the Bible gives us 2 different years. The Bible is a frustrating book to historians. Because it contradicts itself on almost every page. This, of course, is a popular representation, a modern representation of the Nativity, the birth of Jesus, who's very cheerful about the whole thing. And according to the Bible, mainly according to the Gospel of St. Luke, Luke wrote most of the Gospel, or in his Gospel you can see most of the Nativity. Jesus was born when his parents, or actually Joseph and Maria, went to Bethlehem, for reasons we don't really understand. Why would you take a pregnant woman traveling around the country? A woman he wasn't married to, by the way, according to the Bible. Why would you do that? Then we have made out of that story that they were in this sort of stable setting. It says no such thing in the Bible. And there they had their baby, and then they stayed there for 2 weeks. That makes the stable story somewhat unlikely, that you would have to spend one night in the stable because the inn was full. Understandable, but if someone has a baby in that stable, you wouldn't leave them there for 2 weeks, would you? But we see them always with an ass and actually it's supposed to be an ox. This is a cow. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's supposed to be an ass, an ox. And here, this is Hans Memling, same picture, different age, made in 1479. And here we see the nativity scene, and of course the wise men who came 12 days later. Always 3 of them in paintings. No number is given in the Bible. There's only a number of gifts given in the Bible, and you wouldn't expect wise men to come empty-handed, so there's 3 of them. And tradition made it so that they usually look the same way. They have a typical appearance. One is an elderly gentleman, one is middle-aged, and one is younger and African. Often, not always, but there's a reason for that. They're the 3 continents. The older man is Europe, the middle-aged man is supposed to be Turkish or Middle Eastern, which makes him Asian, and the African man is obviously Africa. And so the whole world adores the child. That's what they're supposed to show us. When they discovered more continents, no more wise men were invented. They don't have any names in the Bible, by the way. They do have in popular conception. They have names, they're Balthasar, Gaspar, and Melchior. But they're never mentioned in the Bible. There's 2 different stories, or 2 different things that happen in the Bible. One is that they went to Bethlehem during the reign of King Herod the Great, King Herod the First. Trouble is, King Herod died 4 years before the year 0. And they also say they went there because of a census. No census was held during the reign of King Herod the First. There was one when the new governor of Syria, Exiguus, when he was in power, but that's 6 to 9 after BC. And so AD. That gives us a gap of at least a decade. So somewhere in between. So we have to be sure at least in the year 1 is not 2015 cycles ago. If that was the birth of Christ, is at least not that time. There's also many more gaps in history. The Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, we miss quite a few decades where we have no information at all. And there's no way to link other calendars, for instance, China, because there wasn't much contact, not enough to link them. And besides, China has gaps as well, oddly enough in the same sort of period. There are quite a few theories about how many years exactly we miss. If you add all of them up, if you believe all of them, which you shouldn't, and add all of them up, we would have missed 3 centuries by now. Now that's very, very unlikely. But we've missed quite a few. At least a bunch of years. This is one by Rogier van der Weijden. It's in the Alte Pinacotheca in Munich. And it shows us 3 different stories about the Nativity. One, of course, the Annunciation, where Mary is told that she's going to have Jesus. Here, the adoration by the 3 wise men. In this case, there's no African one. And then the presentation in the temple in Jerusalem. We always say that this was in December, on the 25th of December, this birth. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't mention a season, doesn't mention anything about the time of year. It suggests, though, that it was in March. Because of a number of different events that happened at the same time. They had this baby. They had to wait in the stable for some reason. Well, they don't mention the stable. 3 wise men came by. She had a cleansing ritual. And then they went to Jerusalem, nearby Bethlehem, went to the main temple in Jerusalem to present their firstborn child to the temple. And then, it says in Luke, they went back every year to celebrate Passover, which sort of suggests that they were there during Passover, which would be sort of with the around about the time of the vernal equinox, spring. Nowadays, the 21st of March. They made it in December because there were so many celebrations in December. And the 25th of December is actually a very common birth date for gods. As far as I know, there's no other date in the year where so many gods were born. Or their births were celebrated. Apollo, for one, was born on the 25th of December. Mithra, which is a Persian god. Sol Invictus, which was a slightly later incarnation of Apollo, which was celebrated by the Romans, possibly after Christ's birth was celebrated. Another odd thing about these nativity scenes, there's a bunch of things that you always see in them. One is that they're from the 15th century onwards, and first in Northern Europe and later in Southern Europe, they're not just in any sort of stable. The stable is a ruin of a much bigger building. It's sort of a palace in ruins. And that's an interpretation of the word in the Bible that he comes from the house of David. That's, by the way, why they had to go to Bethlehem. If you would actually organize a census, you would not ask people to go to the town where they came from or where their families came from, because that means that everybody starts to travel. When you hold a census, you want everybody to stay in one place for a few days. You actually would tell them not to travel. But they had to go to Bethlehem because that's where the house of David was. And it's represented in nativity scenes because you see this sort of ruined palace that's going to be rebuilt by the new King of Kings. And you can also see it because very often there's a basement visible. That's the foundation. The Old Testament is the foundation of the New Testament. It says no such thing in the Bible. But in pictures, these pictures were used for for sermons. And so you wanted to illustrate your sermon. There's also other things that were never mentioned in the Bible. The ass, the donkey. It says nowhere in the Bible that there was a donkey anywhere nearby. And the ox wasn't there either. Or at least, well, there's no stable, so why would you have an ox in a hotel? There is a reason though, because the ass is there because they travel to Bethlehem. It's a transportation, it's their donkey. And the ox is there for a different reason. It's there because of St. Luke. Every one of the evangelists has a symbolic animal that accompanies it, in pictures, that is. So you can recognize them. And since this is according to the Gospel of St. Luke, you need an ox. St. Luke has several stories. The Nativity is one of them, where he wasn't present, he just describes it. But there's also a story which is not biblical, but about St. Luke. He was the one who, in a vision, saw Mary with a child and painted her. That's why he's the patron saint of painters. And that's why he has been painted quite a lot. But you see him painting the Virgin with an ox. There has to be an ox present, otherwise it's just a painter painting a lady and a child. Here, another one. Well, it's difficult to see in this light, but trust me, there's an ox over here. And that makes it St. Luke. That's how you recognize the guy. So that's why there's an ox, and that's why in the earlier picture, this one, it's simply wrong to have a cow. There is another odd detail. In the 15th century onwards, especially in the 15th century in Northern Europe, they started to paint much more detail than they could ever do before because they became really good at painting in oils. And that means you can make much more detail than they could before. And so their clients started to ask for more details. And one of the details people wanted to have, or what the church wanted to have, because that's the client in this case, they wanted to say that they wanted to show the entire story. So it's not just any child being born and being adored by wise men from the East, it is the Christ. So you have to remind people that it is the Christ, and you have to give them the entire storyline, from beginning to end, in one picture. And they did. Well, here from the way they did it in this case, because here, in the background, there's a crucifix. They weren't for sale yet. Crucifixion hadn't happened yet. It would be 33 years later, or so. Now, enough about ruining Christmas. There's also the question of why do we have months the way we have them? And our calendar. Our calendar, of course, Julius Caesar started it. Julius Caesar was never an emperor. His, more or less, son, Octavian, became the first emperor. He was the one who took power after a very long civil war in the Roman Empire. And he got 3 jobs together. One was emperor, which was the leader of all the armies. Another one was Pontifex Maximus, now the title for a pope, but he's the great bridge builder, the most supreme priest in the Roman Empire. And he was princeps, first citizen of Rome. And if you have those 3 jobs together, you're super powerful within the Roman Empire, and that's what we started to call an emperor or a Caesar. In this statue, he has all the 3 guards for all 3 functions at the same time, and a little angel looking up his skirt. This statue was copied hundreds of times and placed all over cities in the Roman Empire. And he did something to the Julian calendar. He made his so-called father, Julius Caesar, his adopted father, he made him into a godlike. Because the Romans would have months, and the months were named after gods. They started with their most important god, and then worked their way down. And he named one of these months that hadn't been named yet, Julius, July. And then he said, well, I'm going to be the exalted one. That's what Augustus means. So the next month, it's going to be me. There was a problem though. July had 31 days. Augustus had 30 days. He didn't like that. He couldn't be less important than Julius Caesar. So he added a third one. That's why August is 31 days. Just to be the same as Julius Caesar. And that meant they had to rob a day of the last month of the year, which is, of course, February. February is the last month of the Roman year. And you can see that because September, for instance, September, the 9th month, it means 7th. December, the 12th month, it means 10th. Can go on, October, 8th. Anyway, they never got around to naming them. March is the first month of the year, according to Romans. It was named after their most important god, Mars. Mars, not just the god of war, but also the god of new beginnings. And he would start new things. And that's why it's in March. And probably they started the 1st of March on the vernal equinox, so on the first day of spring. And it just shifted in their own calendar. And when Mars met Venus, they fell in love and things started to grow. And one of the appearance forms of Venus is called a primavera, or April. Now, they had a pretty good calendar, and people believed that that calendar worked really, really well until about just before 1500. And 1500 was the end of days. We've all survived a number of end of days by this time. That's lucky of us. Of course, you know the world ended in 2012, according to the Aztec calendar. It also ended in 2000, according to many other calendars, and it was supposed to end in 1500. We know this from a number of sources. One of them is, we can see it in the sales of art, which is apocalypse books. Apocalypse books are the last book of the Bible, just Revelations, and they were sold in great numbers in the last decade of the 15th century. People preparing for the end of days. Albrecht Dürer, one of the great artists of his day, probably the Michelangelo of the North, he made an illustrated version because he thought it would sell a lot of copies. It did. And this is the first of his illustrations. Here we see St. John. This is the story before Revelation starts. He's being tortured before he's kicked out of Ephesus. He's tortured. They wanted to kill him by cooking him in oil, so he's being deep fried. It didn't hurt him though. God protected him, and so they exiled him and sent him off to Lesbos. Odd sort of punishment, I think. But every chapter of Revelations is then illustrated, and lots of people bought these books as preparation for the end of days. Now, what happened is that at the first day of 1500, the world didn't end. Now, that was probably the 25th of December of 1499, because by now the church adopted that as the first day of the year. It didn't end. So they prepared for the 1st of March. Didn't end then. So they took a number of other dates in the year, still didn't end. And that was so confusing. This guy was the Pope at the time, Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope. There's a popular series about him, 2 of them actually. Strange series because he appears as a rather crazy despot. But they left out the most embarrassing bits. Probably because we would find them too horrible today. He murdered people when he was Pope. He had children when he was Pope with some of his mistresses, openly. He made them cardinal. He made the youngest cardinal ever, he was 6 years old. Anyway, he was a Borgia Pope, Alexander VI. He was crazy. He was completely crazy. He was Ben Carson crazy. He was. He thought he was ascended from one of his forefathers was Osiris, an Egyptian god. Odd for a pope to think that. Anyway, he had some wise advisors, and they said, if the world didn't end in 1500, it must be because we calculate time wrong. Our understanding of time must be wrong. So they got a number of, let's call them scientists, together, and they formed what we would now call a think tank. And they thought deep and hard for 82 years to come up with the next step in the calendar. Introduced by Gregorius XIII in 1582. After all their hard thinking, they managed to find a lapse in time. They said, yes, we're wrong about how we calculate time, but not by centuries, but more by days. And they said, they introduced the Gregorian calendar, which said on the 4th of October of 1582, the next day would not be the 5th of October, but the 15th of October. What he introduced is leap years already existed. He said, now we have to, that sort of overcompensates. Every century would be not a leap year, although you would expect it to be. And then every 4th century will be a leap year. And then you'll be sort of all right. We'll miss an entire day after 3,224 years. But we'll see about that when we get there. But that's the Gregorian calendar we have today. Now I can tell you a lot more about these things, and we can go into measuring of time and all that sort of thing. But I know I've been talking for way too long, and it's kind of time to go out and see the biggest clock we have here in Utrecht. Actually, you don't have to see it, of course, you have to listen to it. But if there's any questions, now would be the time.